Welcome to Big Business This Week. I'm Dave Briggs on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Chaos in the nation's capital over a freeze on all federal grants. But first, what one of the world's biggest tech investors, Mark Andreessen, called AI's Sputnik moment. China-based DeepSeek AI, built on a fraction of the budget of its U.S. competitors, stunning the world and sending Nvidia stock plummeting, falling nearly $600 billion in one day, the largest one-day wipeout of wealth in U.S. history. Louise Matsakis is the senior business editor at Wired. She joined us to explain what happened, starting with what exactly is DeepSeek.
DeepSeek is a Chinese AI startup. They have a really interesting story, actually. They are spun out of a quant trading hedge fund, actually, in China. And so they're sort of the research arm of that fund. And they have created a new open source model that is capable of reasoning. So what that means is that when you ask a question to ChatGPT, you just get an answer back, right? If you ask, what's the capital of Japan, it will say Tokyo right away. Whereas this model will actually show you step by step how it's thinking through its process. And that's going to be really useful in the future as we use AI, especially agents, to do things on our behalf, right? We want to be able to know what are the steps that it's taking to, say, book a flight for you or to, put appointments on your calendar. And that's why this reasoning capability is so interesting.
Wow, that is fascinating. How does the user experience, its effectiveness compare to, say, ChatGPT?
So a lot of experts are saying that ChatGPT and DeepSeek are pretty comparable in terms of, benchmarks, their capabilities. So you can ask both of these apps questions like, really advanced scientific questions. You can ask math questions, coding questions, and both of these models are pretty equivalent in terms of how good they are at responding to those kinds of queries. I think in terms of like the average user experience, it's pretty similar, although I do think there is one big difference, which is that the DeepSeek app is censored so that it is in compliance with the rules and regulations of the Chinese government.
Yeah, don't expect information on Tiananmen Square, for example. What are they saying, at least, about the cost to develop DeepSeek, and how does that compare to others here in the U.S.?
Totally. So in one research paper, DeepSeek said that to develop one of their models, it costs a little bit less than $6 million, which is, not nothing. But OpenAI has previously said that to develop one of its models, it costs upwards of $100 million. So we're talking about less than 1/10 the cost potentially. But I think it's worth saying that that's not necessarily a full picture, but it certainly indicates a certain direction and a certain amount of resources that might be necessary to create these sorts of technologies.
I read that with a bit of a grain of salt compared to seemingly everyone else in the tech world. China exaggerates wildly their GDP. They steal intellectual property. They cheat with forced technology transfers. It's literally written into their constitution. Why is the world taking them at their word here on the cost to develop this AI?
Well, I think it's really simple, which is that unlike OpenAI or other US competitors like Anthropic, DeepSeek made its model open source. So you can actually see the exact techniques, the exact technology, the strategies that they use in order to build this. So that makes those sorts of figures a lot more reputable because other experts can literally just read their research paper and they can copy exactly how DeepSeek did this and see how much it cost them, right? We're not actually taking them just on their word. We're looking at the documentation, the research. They released something called the model weights, which is basically how they calibrated the AI in order to perform as well as it does. That is extremely guarded, secret, trade secrets, according to companies like OpenAI. So this is a really different approach, and it makes it a lot easier to sort of validate what they've done here. You don't have to take them for their word.
Boy, thank you for that clarification. So the other story here was Nvidia. They are up 6% today, but shed nearly $600 billion in market cap, largest ever single-day wipeout of wealth. That is more than the value of Home Depot or Netflix or ExxonMobil. Why?
So for the last few years, the basic, common sense in the AI industry is that we're going to put more compute, we're going to buy more Nvidia chips, we're going to hoard as many Nvidia chips as possible, and that is how we're going to build more and more powerful models. That was ideology or a philosophy called scaling. But what DeepSeek is showing is that you can use clever techniques, you can use more sophisticated software, you can use off-the-shelf tools in order to make models that are potentially just as powerful, but don't require all of those computing resources. So I think investors and the market are saying, okay, well, if you can make this technology without having to spend $100 million on Nvidia chips, then maybe, Nvidia's value is inflated.
Very interesting. The other element here is the billions of dollars going into the data centers. So you told us about the development costs for DeepSeek. Does it pump the brakes on the massive spend on the power needed for the AI here in the US?
Absolutely. I mean, potentially, at least, I think it shows that you don't need a gigantic data center full of these Nvidia semiconductors or all of this hardware in order to power these models, which is good news for the environment. It's good news for the electric grid. And I think it just shows, also the power, like I said, of sort of open source models, right? If you can take something off the shelf and build, a custom model that way, instead of having to have your own data center, have, a custom gigantic model that each individual company is running, that really brings down cost. I think it's worth noting here that DeepSeek relied on Llama, which is the open source model developed by Meta. So you can already see that this is sort of a global project, and that definitely brings down the need for things like, huge data centers.
Interesting. So TikTok is also in the news for good reason. President Trump, then President Biden, a bipartisan majority of Congress, backed up by the Supreme Court, all determined TikTok was a national security concern. Why isn't DeepSeek, and how concerned should we be?
Well, I think that's a really good point, which is that the idea of going after a single app and playing this game of whack-a-mole is incredibly ineffective. I think that Congress should have passed broad, comprehensive privacy protections that would protect Americans regardless of what the specific application is that they're using, whether it's DeepSeek, whether it's other Chinese apps like Temu or Shein, which are shopping platforms, or if it's a social media platform like TikTok. The rules of the road should be the same. But what we've seen is that the last few years, Congress and the White House have spent a lot of time focusing on a single app. And I think the last few weeks have shown that that's not a very effective strategy when there are a lot of really compelling Chinese applications out there, or, in the future, there could be apps from Russia or from other governments that we find, potentially troubling.
I've read some reports that it's able to, DeepSeek, scrape your Gmail. Are you able to confirm how much info or how much data it can collect on its users?
From what I've seen, it's definitely collecting information on its users, but I don't think that its collection patterns are necessarily above and beyond a lot of other applications that we already have on our phone. I think that national origin is not a good benchmark or the only indicator that people should look at when they're thinking about their privacy. The reality is that you could have an innocent looking game on your phone that is tracking your location and everywhere you go, and then that information is being sold to China, right? It's not enough to sort of just look at the national origin. And from what I've seen, DeepSeek is not necessarily collecting any more data than another type of application of the same kind, but it is collecting a lot of data because the apps on our phone collect a lot of data. So it's definitely something that users should be aware of. And I don't think I would want to provide DeepSeek any, personal identifying information about me, or to use it for things at work or something like that. I think when I was testing it, I was asking it questions like, I have some pomegranates in my fridge, and I said, what sort of recipe should I use that for, right? I would use it for that sort of query if you're curious to try it out. And I would make sure in your settings that you're not allowing it to track your location, that you're not providing it your personal identifying information, maybe use throwaway email address or something like that.
So what pomegranate recipes did it give you?
It gave me a list of 15 that were actually pretty good. It was yogurt parfaits. I think there was a Middle Eastern inspired rice pilaf dish that they gave me. It was actually pretty good. It was impressive.
When I downloaded it, I think it was during this malicious attack, so I couldn't actually sign up. What happened there, and is that all wrapped up? What do you have to hand over to join DeepSeek?
Yeah, so yesterday for a few hours, I think it has been resolved. They said that due to a malicious attack, only mainland users in China could sign up. So you had to have a Chinese phone number. But in order to sign up in the US now, and I think, again, you can try it if you want, you do need to provide an email address. And then you need to provide a code that you get from that to that email. So you can't just make up an email address. It won't let you do that. You need to validate that you have access to the email address. And then it's just a password. It's not too much information to sign up. But again, it's more about like your settings on your phone and also what you're using it for. We've seen that a lot of people quickly start trusting these AIs and provide them, really sensitive medical information or personal information.
Luis Matsakis, senior business editor at Wired, thanks so much. Coming up, mass confusion across the country this week after President Trump halted all federal assistance. What happened and where are we now? That's next. Welcome back to Big Business This Week. A week of mass confusion across the country after the White House ordered an immediate freeze on federal grants and loans. Not entirely clear where the order stands today, nor whom or what is on the chopping block. Politico White House reporter Adam Cankren hopefully has the answers. He's going to sift through the chaos for us. Good to see you, my friend. It is shoot first, ask questions later. It's back in D.C. So let's go back to where it began. Where did this order come from? What was the design of the order?
Yeah, absolutely. And good to be with you. It has been fast and furious here in the first week and a half. It feels like a year and a half already. But this came originally from an executive order, one of a flurry that Donald Trump signed in his first days of office. This was targeting federal funding for things like DEI programs and climate initiatives. And that kind of set the stage for this really puzzling OMB memo that came out just a few nights ago, kind of dropped with no explanation, was blanket in terms of basically saying all federal assistance, federal grants should be halted so that the government could examine one by one all of them and determine whether they would go forward. That created mass confusion. Shortly afterward, the OMB actually rescinded that memo. But the White House said that there were still some parts of it that were going to remain in effect. Yeah. And so what we have here now is just a ton of confusion and no real concrete answers.
Yeah, typically you would evaluate those grants prior to freezing them. Step two was the reaction from both the courts and groups across the country. What was it?
Yeah, the courts immediately put a temporary restraining order on this initial OMB memo and the funding freeze. And that's why there was then the rescission of the memo. But at the same time, the White House press secretary saying, basically, we just rescinded the memo to get around the courts. We still want to freeze all of this money. And that's kind of where we sit now. The courts are now looking at this initial executive order and whether any of this funding can be frozen. And then obviously on Capitol Hill, this is playing out as one of the first massive controversies with both Republicans and Democrats trying to figure out just how to handle this and what the impact is going to be on their home districts and states.
Fears were everything from school lunches to Medicare reimbursements. How much of that is reality?
It's really unclear. I mean, look, one of the big questions was Medicaid, right? There was a massive issue with states being able to get their Medicaid money to pay providers, doctors, hospitals. In the 24 hours after that initial memo went out, the White House said, look, any direct funding, any direct assistance to individuals, including Medicaid, should not have been affected. But one of the things that was a result here is that even folks in the government didn't know how much of a blanket freeze this should be. And so you got a lot of confusion, a lot of preemptive kind of holds and pauses just to make sure that they were playing it safe and complying with the memo if it happened to touch their area. So that's still what we're sorting out here. They say no direct assistance to individuals, but it's kind of, you have to kind of go piecemeal here.
But that assistance did ultimately end up with individuals, and that seemed to be the disconnect between the entire White House press corps and the now 27-year-old White House press secretary. Is any of this federally legal to simply freeze overnight with no notice?
This is a huge question. This goes to the constitutionality of just doing this. Look, the Constitution is kind of accepted up until now that when Congress allocates money, the federal government must spend it. And what Trump and what Russ Vought, who's the nominee to be the OMB head, what they have kind of made a case for is that actually the White House should determine what money is spent and when, and if some they don't feel like spending, then they just won't. And this goes to the core of the constitutional issue. It will go through the courts, potentially up to the Supreme Court. Really, really a big legal conundrum and decision coming up here.
So how representative was this last week of Trump's process? How does it resemble that travel ban from the first term?
It was a very stark reminder, right, of what the first term of Trump was, right? There are things happening, a flurry of actions every day. What Trump officials have described it as is this attempt at shock and awe to just essentially overwhelm the system, right? Make sure that Trump every single day is at the center of the news, that people are thinking about him every single day. That's the goal here, to just kind of overwhelm people with a bunch of action and try to do things very quickly. The main difference, I would say, between this time and the first Trump term is this time has been much more organized. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not creating a lot of confusion, that a lot of details are not filled in yet. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the overarching things that this administration wants to do, especially when it comes to cutting funding, when it comes to trying to cut down on the number of federal employees, just slash employment, these are the things that they're going at very concertedly. And so we're seeing a level of focus in this administration that we did not see the first time around when Trump was a political novice.
Of course, Adam, also some very high-profile cabinet confirmation hearings this week, and controversial ones. RFK stumbling through the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, ironic since he would be the HHS secretary with a $1.7 trillion overall budget. But arguably the most controversial choice could be Kash Patel as FBI director. He'll go through the grilling on Thursday. Any chance any one of these picks will fail to get through, with the Republican Party, quite frankly, that is lockstep behind everything Trump says and does at the moment?
Yeah, ironically, of the ones that are up today, Kash Patel seems like the safest. He seems like the one who is most assured to get through, despite his kind of litany of controversial statements, his enemies list that he's alluded to in the past. He actually seems on the safest footing. The one who seems to be at most danger right now is Tulsi Gabbard. A lot of questions just about her past. One, as a Democrat for a lot of very conservative Republicans, and two, her past associations with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. If you're going to run the nation's intelligence apparatus, there's a lot of skepticism among senators over what she actually believes there. And then obviously you mentioned it, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This is a guy who has been an influential leader in the anti-vaccine movement, doesn't have really any government policy-making experience. He is currently being grilled now by the Senate Health Committee. It's going to be a very close vote either way. Could swing one or two votes most likely.
Bro, I am still picking my jaw up off the floor from what you said about Kash Patel. I mean, this is a man that said the FBI is part of the deep state. He published a list of enemies. You don't think there is 4 votes against that man to run the FBI?
As of now, it really doesn't seem like it. I mean, look, this is one of the people, right, that Donald Trump and his allies have really focused on as somebody they want in there. They see him as deeply loyal to Trump. And for Republicans who over the last several years have become convinced that the FBI and the federal kind of authorities have been weaponized against Trump and against Republicans, this is a way of saying, look, we're getting back, right? We're making sure we have somebody who is not attached to the weaponization of the Justice Department and of the FBI, and who's going to go in there and just clean it out. And so there is a little bit of retribution feeling here, but also a sense of like, look, if you want to stay in Trump's good graces, Kash Patel is one of the people who needs to make it through.
Wow, speechless. Politico White House reporter Adam Cankern, great job. Good to see you. Thank you. Coming up, an on again, off again, major airline merger may be back on again. What it means for you, the passengers. Next. Welcome back to Big Business This Week. Time now to bring in our friend Peter Green, who authors our Big Business This Week newsletter. Good to see you, Peter. So the on again, off again merger between Frontier Airlines and Spirit Airlines appears to be on again, or is it?
Good question. I mean, it's kind of like trying to snag that date for the high school prom. You know, first, first Spirit rejected Frontier. That was about 2 years ago, saying we're going to go with JetBlue. But the Justice Department sued and said consolidating JetBlue and Spirit was going to do a lot of damage to consumers' low price options. Since then, unfortunately, Spirit has gotten itself into more and more debt. It's losing over $100 million a quarter. It's declared filed for bankruptcy protection, and it's got about $800 million in debt. Now it's got a plan to emerge from bankruptcy protection, and Frontier wants to take it over as it emerges. Spirit so far has said, your offer's too low, sweeten it. Let's dance around a little bit and sit down and talk again. So, this it's very likely to go somewhere because it's not clear that Spirit can survive on its own.
I can't help but wonder if that JetBlue merger that was scrapped by the federal government could end up on again now that the Trump administration is in and a more friendly merger administration. But the point of this is, why are these budget airlines, when travel is at all-time highs, all 10 of the highest traffic TSA days came this year, why are they losing money?
So they've got two big things going against them. The first is that they tend to have fairly new fleets, not as much revenue. So they've got a lot of very high lease costs, and they often don't have their own maintenance program. So they have to farm out the maintenance, and that gets more expensive. The second issue they've got is that where they compete tend to be on the big routes, and the bigger carriers can compete with them. So it hasn't really worked out as well. There was a time when people would fly from, Cleveland to Oakland or something, but that has really diminished, that kind of flying. There's a lot more hub and spoke, and the budget carriers just can't always compete with the big ones, particularly for business travelers and particularly with the frequent flyer miles.
And now both Spirit and Frontier are trying new first-class-like perks and seats to try to generate some profit, but still, long way to go to emerge from bankruptcy, at least for Spirit. Our thanks to Peter Green. Make sure to check out his weekly newsletter by going to cheddar.com/BBTW. That's going to do it for us this week. Don't go away. Much more Cheddar up next.